On the morning of December 6, 1917, hundreds of people in Halifax, Nova Scotia, stopped what they were doing to watch a ship burn. It was drifting in the harbor, throwing up a strange, almost beautiful column of orange and black smoke, and people came to the windows to look. Office workers, dockhands, children in classrooms who climbed onto their desks to see the pretty fire out on the water. Not one of them knew that the ship was a floating bomb. At 9:04, it went off. It was the largest explosion the human race had ever produced, and for a few seconds, a corner of Canada became the closest thing to the end of the world that anyone alive had ever seen. Close to 2,000 people died. A city was flattened in an instant. 200 people were blinded at their own windows. And then the world moved on and almost forgot it happened. This is the story of the blast before the bomb. And it's the story of how the disaster everyone forgot became the measuring stick for the weapon that would end the next war. In 1917, Halifax was a boom town at war. It had one of the finest deep harbors in the world, and it sat at the very edge of North America, the last stop before the Atlantic. Every convoy of troops, every shipment of food and shells and horses bound for the trenches of Europe, funneled through this one port. The harbor was crowded with gray ships. The city behind it was crowded with sailors, soldiers, and the families who had come for the work. To reach the inner harbor, a ship had to pass through a narrow neck of water called the Narrows, in places barely half a kilometer wide, with Halifax on one shore and the town of Dartmouth on the other. On that morning, 2 ships were about to meet in that narrow channel. Coming in from the sea was the Mont-Blanc, a tired French cargo ship riding low and heavy in the water. In her hold and stacked on her deck was a cargo no crew ever wanted to carry. Nearly 3,000 tons of high explosives, TNT, picric acid, gun cotton, and drums of aviation fuel lashed to the deck in the open air. She was, in every real sense, a bomb with an engine, and she was riding into the most crowded harbor on the continent. Coming the other way, headed out to sea, was the Emo, a Norwegian ship, empty, running late, and moving faster than she should have been. They were on a collision course, in the worst possible place, carrying the worst possible cargo. What happened next took only a few minutes, and it came down to a handful of small human errors. In the tight channel, the 2 ships read each other wrong. Whistle signals were blown and answered and blown again. 1 blast, 2 blasts, a disagreement about who would pass on which side. The Emo was too far over, in the wrong water. Both captains tried at the last moment to turn away. It was too late. The Emo's bow slid into the side of the Mont-Blanc. Not a hard blow, more of a grinding scrape. On any other ship, it would have been a dented hull and an angry argument. But the scrape tore open the drums of fuel on the Mont-Blanc's deck, and the 2 hulls grinding together threw a shower of sparks. The fuel caught. Within seconds, the deck was on fire. The French crew knew exactly what was underneath that fire. They abandoned ship almost immediately, rowing for the Dartmouth shore as hard as they could, screaming warnings that no one on land could understand, because the warnings were in French, and the men on the docks spoke English. So the burning Mont-Blanc drifted, unmanned, across the harbor and came to rest against a wooden pier on the Halifax side. The pier began to burn. Fire crews raced toward it, and all along the waterfront and up the hillside of the crowded Richmond neighborhood, people gathered to watch the show. For 19 minutes, the most dangerous object in the world sat burning at a city pier, while the city came closer to look. At 9:35 the fire reached the cargo. The Mont-Blanc did not so much explode as cease to exist. Nearly 3,000 tons of explosive detonated in a single instant. A blast later estimated at close to 3 kilotons, the equivalent of roughly 3,000 tons of TNT going off at once. It was the largest man-made explosion in human history, and it would keep that title until the summer of 1945. The ship was vaporized. A white-hot fireball climbed over the harbor, and above it rose a churning column of black smoke nearly 2 kilometers high, a shape the world would come to know decades later by a different name. The shockwave leveled almost everything within a 2.5-kilometer radius. The entire Richmond district, homes, churches, factories, the school, was swept flat in the time it takes to blink. The blast drove the water out of the harbor so violently that for a moment the muddy bottom was exposed, and then the sea rushed back in as a wave nearly 18 meters high that picked up ships and boats and threw them onto the land. The Mont-Blanc's anchor shaft, a piece of iron weighing half a ton, was thrown more than 3.5 kilometers through the air. Pieces of the ship came down across the whole city. Windows shattered 80 kilometers away. The sound was heard on Prince Edward Island and Cape Breton, more than 200 kilometers distant. In the time it has taken to read this, more than 1,500 people were already dead. The people who survived the blast now faced everything that came after it. The 200 who were blinded had been standing at their windows, watching the fire, when the shockwave turned every pane of glass in the city into flying knives. Flying glass took the eyes of men, women, and children in the same instant. Fires broke out everywhere, fed by the coal stoves and furnaces that had been knocked over across a city on a cold December morning. Trapped families burned in the wreckage of their own homes while neighbors dug at the rubble with their hands. And then, in one of history's cruelest turns, the weather arrived. The very next morning, a blizzard settled over the ruined city and dropped 40 centimeters of snow. It buried the wreckage the rescuers were still digging through. It froze survivors who had lost their homes. It stopped the relief trains on the tracks. Help came anyway. The nearest big city, Boston, learned of the disaster and had a train loaded with doctors, nurses, and supplies rolling north within a day through the same storm. That kindness was never forgotten. Every single year since, the people of Nova Scotia have sent the city of Boston a giant Christmas tree in thanks for a debt more than a century old. The city had survived the blast. Now it had to survive the winter. When the snow cleared and the dead were counted, a country demanded an answer to a simple question. Whose fault was this? A formal inquiry opened within weeks. The hearings were tense and bitter, and they quickly turned on the 2 men who had been steering the ships, the Mont-Blanc's harbor pilot and her captain. The inquiry's first verdict fell entirely on them. The pilot was arrested. Both men were charged with manslaughter, and for a while the city had the villains it wanted, but the case fell apart almost as fast as it was built. There was no clear law broken, no single hand to blame. The manslaughter charges were dropped. No one was convicted. When the courts finally sorted through the whistle signals and the wrong side maneuvers, they landed on a verdict that satisfied no one. Both ships had been at fault, and neither one entirely. So the largest man-made explosion in history, a blast that killed close to 2,000 people and blinded hundreds, ended with no one held responsible. The blame was split down the middle, filed away, and closed. But the disaster had left behind more than a body count. It had left a record. A strange, cold, exhaustive record of exactly what a blast that size does to a real city. For 25 years, almost no one would want it. And then someone would come looking for it, for a reason no one in 1917 could have imagined. Even in the middle of the grief, something clinical was happening in Halifax. The explosion was, for scientists and engineers, an accident on a scale that had never been available to study before. So they studied it. They mapped the blast, ring by ring, out from the pier where the Mont-Blanc had burned, where the destruction was total, where walls still stood but roofs were gone, where windows broke but frames held. They cataloged how far the pressure wave traveled and what it did at every distance. Doctors recorded in painful detail the exact injuries a shock wave inflicts on the human body: the crushed lungs, the ruptured ears, the wounds from flying glass. It became the most thoroughly documented explosion the world had ever produced. And once the reports were written and the city was rebuilt, all of that knowledge did what most knowledge does. It went into filing cabinets and archives and technical journals, and it sat there, quietly, while the world finished one war and stumbled toward the next. For a generation, the record of Halifax gathered dust, a precise, unwanted answer to a question nobody was asking, until a small group of scientists, working in secret, went looking for exactly that answer. Because they were building something new, and they needed to know one thing above all: what happens when a single blast destroys an entire city? There was only one real place on Earth where that had ever happened. By the middle of the Second World War, the physicists building the atomic bomb faced a problem that had nothing to do with physics. They could calculate the energy their weapon would release. What they could not easily picture was the human reality of it, what one bomb would actually do to a living city of streets and houses and people. Nothing like it had ever been done on purpose. There was no test that told you how far the windows would break, how wide the fires would spread, how a shockwave would move through neighborhoods. But there had been an accident that told you almost exactly that. Halifax was the closest thing the world had to a rehearsal for the atomic age, a multi-kiloton blast that had erased a real city and been measured down to the last shattered pane. The scale, the pressure rings, the pattern of destruction spreading out from a single point, the blindings, the fires, the wave. It was, in the grim arithmetic of blast effects, the reference the new weapon could be measured against. The forgotten disaster of 1917 became a yardstick for the bombs of 1945. And there is one last echo, the kind history leaves almost as a signature. When the survivors of Halifax had described what they saw rising over the harbor that morning, they reached for the only words that fit: a pillar of smoke, a churning cloud that climbed and flattened and spread against the sky. 28 years later, when the world watched that same shape rise over Hiroshima, it finally had a name for it. But it wasn't new. Halifax had seen it first. The Halifax explosion is still, to this day, one of the largest non-nuclear blasts ever recorded. It reshaped the science of what explosions do to cities. It killed nearly 2,000 people, and it never truly left the place it happened. And yet, outside of Canada, most of the world has never heard of it. The blast that showed us what the end of a city looks like was documented, and then buried under the century that came after, until the one weapon that could finally rival it went looking for what it had left behind. This is Buried Records, where the things the world tried to forget get dug back up. If this one stayed with you, subscribe, and we'll keep digging.